afternoon and welcome to another Bird News and Views. I'm your host, Don Burgess, and today we are going to be talking about the lawsuit being brought against the Bermuda government with regard to mandatory quarantine. And we have three very distinguished gentlemen with us today. Courtenay Griffiths, Senior International Counsel from Bedford Row Chambers. Welcome.
Well, hello. Thank you for inviting me.
And we have Mark Pettingill, former Attorney General and Director of Chancery Legal Bermuda. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
And Eron S.L. Hill, Paralegal for Bedford Row Chambers and Chancery Legal Bermuda. Welcome, Eron.
Thanks, Don.
Mr. Pettingill, why don't we start with you? Why is this lawsuit being brought?
Well, I think, you've seen the issues that have been raised in the last couple of weeks, and effectively it is being brought on the basis that the proposed restrictions on quarantine, and let me be clear because it narrows down to a very specific point, the proposed restrictions on quarantining people that are not vaccinated for a period of 2 weeks in a facility and having them pay for it goes far beyond what is reasonable given the provisions of the Constitution. There is no question that in a time of public health crisis like we have currently faced, that people's freedom of movement and so on can indeed be restricted. You may have to have lockdowns and you may have to have roadblocks and you may have to have these checks and supermarket days and all the rest of it. These are things that one could look at and say, in light of the pandemic, they are reasonably required. And I use those words specifically because that's what Section 11(2) of the Constitution dealing with freedom of movement says, reasonably required in the interest of public health. And the imposition of such restrictions has to be considered as to what is the reasonable test of those things. So I'll give you an example. What we're saying is that what is happening now is that it is a line that's being crossed and is going too far. If you take, by way of an example, a married couple, and you have with two children, let's say, and you have the wife is vaccinated and the husband is not vaccinated and the children are not vaccinated. If they both return to the island and test negative for COVID, then the husband who is not vaccinated has to go into quarantine and pay for it for 2 weeks, and the wife gets to go home with the children. Of course, this is a complete nonsense with respect, because she's equally as susceptible to contracting the virus as is the husband. And we've already seen through quite vivid example that, the vaccine does not prevent the spread of, nor does it prevent people from becoming infected with the virus. And so what we'd say in those circumstances, that type of action is not reasonably required, and it doesn't make sense, candidly, especially when there are very valid alternatives that could be imposed. And I'll give you an example. There's been a lot of legislation, I think 51 various pieces of legislation during the time of COVID that have been passed. The ability to impose fines, and I would suggest even very severe fines, that people have to stay at home and quarantine if they're not vaccinated, and that they are subject to a $10,000 fine and even imprisonment if they breach that quarantine, would be, in my submission, quite enough and reasonable to prevent people from disobeying a quarantine order. Likewise, when it comes to people visiting a home of somebody who's quarantined, you just simply take a notice, you slap it on the front door or whatever with a big red sign saying, this house is under a quarantine provision. If you enter, you are subject to a fine of $10,000 and so on and so forth. We have seen these significant fines imposed on people that breach curfew up to $3,000. So people know that the system is for real when it comes to saying that it will fine you if you're in breach. And the fact of the matter is, thankfully, most people are cooperative and law-abiding in these times of pandemic. And what this smacks at by insisting that non-vaccinated people must go into a facility and must pay for it, thousands of dollars, is really a way of saying, you must get vaccinated. It's taking a heavy-handed approach to saying you must get vaccinated. And there has to be some right that people have to have with regard to a choice over whether they are vaccinated or not. It doesn't mean you can't impose restrictions on them at all. And they have to be accepting of the fact that they may be subject to restrictions because they are not vaccinated. But it's a question of the degree, of the extent of those restrictions and whether they are reasonably necessary in the circumstances. We would say in this instance of enforced quarantine in a facility, they are not reasonable. That's it in a nutshell.
I will take some issue with vaccinated and non-vaccinated, because it's the statistics up to this point seem to show that people who are vaccinated are less likely to get COVID, and it's less severe.
Yep, but they still get it. They still get it. So that's the dividing line, is that, you're probably going to be better off having somebody quarantined at home. That's the key. It is less severe. But it's not even the distinction, to your point, where somebody who's vaccinated simply does not have the potential to get the virus, and somebody who is, would inevitably get it if they're exposed to the same thing. It could be the circumstances, that I've given with man and wife, one being vaccinated and the other not being vaccinated. The person who's vaccinated gets it. The person that doesn't, is the one that does not get infected. And indeed, if we look at it, that's probably happened with regard to people who have been vaccinated and have become infected. They have been with people who have not been vaccinated, and those people have not become infected. So it's a bit of a crapshoot, to be frank. But in any sense, it's the reasonableness of the extent of the imposition of the restriction on movement.
So, part of the thing is, because you mentioned the example of possibly sticking a notice on the door. Government's been very protective of people's medical records and their privacy status as far as being vaccinated. It seems like that might go against that. If you put a notice on somebody's door.
Oh, really? What about the fact that that's just on my door? What about the fact that you're rounding up the people that aren't vaccinated at the airport, and they disappear from work for 2 weeks, having been on a trip? You're kind of broadcasting to all and sundry that they aren't vaccinated. A little bit different to a notice on the door, when you say. I mean, the odd person that comes to your house. And that's their choice. That's their choice. You gave the person a choice to say, would you rather have a notice on your door or going to forced quarantine for 2 weeks? What do you think they're going to say? Come on.
Well, it does seem...
Again, to your point, what's reasonable?
Right. Yeah. Your example of them at the airport, it seems like everybody at the airport will notice who's getting on the non-vaccinated bus to go to a government facility, and then everybody at the airport's going to find out who they are.
It's Bermuda. Everybody will know. Everybody will see them leaving on the bus, or seeing them put in the naughty room or whatever when they get off the plane, and they will see the fact that they're not at work for 2 weeks, they're not at home, they're not anywhere where you would expect them to be. And why not? Because they're in quarantine. So it's something candidly of a nonsense to say that putting a notice on the door would be letting it know that, about their health records. The way that this is being imposed effectively guarantees that you're going to let all and sundry know that there's this issue.
Well, what issues do you see, or constitutional issues do you see, are the same between this and the LGBTQI cases currently waiting a decision from the Supreme Council as far as constitutional freedoms?
Well, that's the main one. I mean, the top drawer of it is about constitutional freedoms. The cases are obviously, very, very different. As one is dealing with public health, and the other is dealing with issues of, challenges of public morality and marriage and so on. So they are distinctively different than that. They are both constitutional right issues. It's just that this one, the imposition of the restrictions is in fact allowed by the Constitution. It's just a question as to whether they are reasonable in the circumstances, specifically with regard to enforced quarantine.
Right. Do you think it makes any difference as to what the cost is? Because I know people have done cost analysis, and they're talking about more than $4,000 for a 2-week stay.
Right. So what happens is your average, individual isn't going to be able to afford that. They're saving up to go on a vacation. They want to go on a vacation. For whatever reasons, and I'll give you another example. I've known of a couple of clients who are endeavoring to have a family and are having challenges with conceiving. And they just are of the view, no matter what they hear, they don't want to put anything into their bodies, as a lady trying to conceive, that may impact on their health. And they take the view that enough is simply not known with regard to the impact of this vaccine. Think about the thalidomide vaccine back in the 60s. Everybody said, oh, take that for morning sickness. You'll be fine. You'll feel better. And there was an absolute tragic occurrence where so many hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of children were born with deformities as a result of thalidomide. So women that are endeavoring to get pregnant are potentially going to be very, very concerned about this, as are the fathers of their children, about that. And they may wish to simply sit in a position of not getting vaccinated. And it may well be that they can't afford to go on a vacation and fork out $4,000 for an enforced quarantine when they're perfectly willing and perfectly happy to say, I'll stay at home. I won't go anywhere, but just let me stay in my house, getting my nursery ready for my baby, like somebody should be able to do in that situation and not go anywhere. So it's the fact that not only is it unreasonable, but there are very reasonable alternatives that can be used.
Yeah, you said alternatives. You mentioned the sticker on the door. I know a lot of people have talked about some sort of monitoring bracelets as well. What
Use a telephone. There's an app. Government's got an app. You can sign up for the app, and everybody knows whether you've been near anybody with COVID. So why can't we do the same thing here? Just have an app. But I'm telling you, if you make it a serious, if you regard it as being that serious, then you fine people. And I have to say that I would be all for people being fined if they, on the position of this case, if they say like, right, I will quarantine at home. I'm not having the vaccine, and I'm not quarantining at home, and then they decide to go out flitting about. I mean, that is obnoxious, and they are in breach of what the law should be, and they deserve to be fined, if not locked up. And so people need to be aware that it will be taken very, very seriously, as is the curfew and all of the other restrictions. We've taken these things really seriously. But I believe that most people are law-abiding, and, in the circumstances of this quarantine, would adhere to that.
Okay. Mr. Griffith, what's made you decide to get involved with this case?
Well, interestingly, the topic has just been raised because when one looks at this regulation, in effect, it's an offense if you don't get vaccinated. And you then get sentenced to internment for a couple of weeks and a fine amounting to $4,000 for the 2 weeks you're in internment. So help me with this. What is the criminal act, the actus reus of the offense you've committed? Nothing at all. And yet, nonetheless, you're going to be sentenced. So what was your mens rea, your thought, which made you guilty of the offense to be granted this sentence? And given my criminal background, that was my concern, my primary concern, when I was first introduced to this topic. And I can't see how that can be done to individuals, given the constitutional rights they have, the right of personal freedom.
So you're more equating it to it's a $4,000 fine for not getting vaccinated if you want to travel.
Yeah. And what crime did you commit? What offense?
Mm-hmm. Eron, do you have any?
Is there a criminal offense?
Right.
You've done nothing.
Mm-hmm. Eron, I want to bring you in a little bit too. Do you have something to add?
I think Mark and Courtney have certainly highlighted the key fundamental issues in question. The only thing I probably would expand on is that this is this problem, this issue, the impending amendments actually hit home for a number of individuals, a number of families. By way of example, you have fathers who have children, Bermudian citizens, who live overseas with their parents, and who bring their young children back home to see their other siblings and to enjoy a normal relationship with their father, for example, during the summertime. Now, if those individuals make the decision not to be vaccinated, and you've got an individual, a father who works hard, who pays his mortgage, but is just making ends meet, He's taking care of his responsibilities, taking care of his family. But because of a decision that they don't wish to be vaccinated, they now have to pay what is going to be at least $4,000. That cannot, under any circumstance, be reasonable, particularly when the regulations, as they are, have provision for the fitting of an ankle monitoring bracelet. For example, as Mark mentioned, the provisions of, if this is as serious as we say that it is, then increase the penalty. We have very serious criminal offenses, and we recognize the seriousness of those offenses by virtue of the penalties that we attach to them. But to basically financially constrain or restrain somebody from enjoying their private family life, it's absolutely unreasonable. It is onerous, and one has to question whether there are any less restrictive measures, any more reasonable measures that we can adopt. And the position that Dr. Griffiths and Mark will take during the actual court case is that there certainly are.
Right. When do you expect if we can just you to reach the 50,000 pounds of the fundraiser that you're having on crowd justice?
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because we actually really want to thank the members of the public, both here in Bermuda and overseas, who have contributed. And Don, what you will realize is that the actual applicants, as we will see, they're not going to represent thousands of applicants, and that would be quite redundant. But they're going to encapsulate individual situations that are representative of a number of other individual cases of people who are concerned. But for their employment, they would become applicants. But for concerns of immigration, they're here and they're concerned about other aspects. But for, I've got this before the court, or I've got this application, and I certainly don't want that to be rejected. And so what you'll see is a number of applicants, and I think there'll probably be about 3 that come before the court, and Dr. Griffiths and Mark will advocate on behalf of them. But in as much as it's about those applicants, they represent an entire population of our citizenry. You will note that our vaccination rate certainly isn't at that 70% that we expected to be at, I think, in 2 weeks. And so what does that tell us? Perhaps that there is a majority of Bermudians that actually believe, or have made the decision that we will not be vaccinated. They should not be penalized for it. Contrary to what has been promulgated out there, this is not about attacking the vaccine. This is not about attacking the legitimacy of COVID-19. This is about the fundamental rights and freedoms, and to what extent the government can do that. And as Mark said, when they do it, it must be reasonably required. And so part of assessing whether or not it's reasonably required is actually having the information. What we've seen is a government who have got in front of press conferences and said, for your health, we're doing X. But there's no scientific or medical data to back that up in the public domain, certainly available for public scrutiny so that the public can say, you know what, we understand why this is necessary. So one of the actual prayers for relief that the applicants will seek, and certainly Mark will expand on this before the court, is, listen, we've got to have the information, because if the threat is so serious, then vaccinated individuals can contract and spread the virus the same way that unvaccinated individuals can, why are they being discriminated against? For a choice. And Dr. Griffiths has highlighted his core point, which is the criminalization of individuals for that choice. And simply put, we say that it's wrong. Mark has given an example of a husband and wife. One husband, these are individual choices. These aren't choices that you simply make unless we're dealing with children where the parents make the decision for the children, where you simply say, as a family, husband and wife are bound to the same decision. A wife may say, you know what, I wish not to be vaccinated, and our husband may wish to be vaccinated. So what does that mean? And if the vaccine has the effect that we believe or want it to have, then why is it that the unvaccinated are being effectively penalized? But Don, I think what we'll see before the court when Dr. Griffiths and Mr. Pettingill actually advocate this is a question of whether or not the objective can be achieved by more reasonable, less restrictive measures. And certainly locking somebody up into a quarantine facility at their expense is unreasonable. And I think we'll realize that, hey, listen, we noticed that the National Security Minister had said during her May 7th press conference that, listen, the reason why you have to pay for it now is because the government had to pay $1.5 million last year, and we simply can't afford that anymore. Well, is it really in the interest of the public health threat, or is this about money? $1.5 million in the context of an emergency to protect the citizenry should be absorbed by a government during these times. But we've also given out, I think, close to $50 million in unemployment benefits. These are the same recipients who will be subject to pay $4,000 in respect of 2 weeks. So I'm going to end with that example of the father who has that child overseas. What does he choose if he's got 3 children here in Bermuda, 1 child overseas? He's now forced to choose. Does he care for his children here, or does he bring or jeopardize his relationship with his child who's overseas? And that, unfortunately, is what the government's imposed regulations or intended amendments will have. And so we look forward to Dr. Griffiths and Mr. Pettingill certainly arguing that before the court in due course. But that's, in a nutshell, what it amounts to.
Yeah, but I mean, government has put out stats showing that people who've been vaccinated are less likely to be in the hospital. I mean, I think the chart that was out last week showed like nobody who'd had 2 vaccinations were one of the cases that had been hospitalized.
Well, let's be clear, Don, that I could put together a chart for you now. But certainly that chart isn't anything that you could pass to a medical or scientific expert to scrutinize whether or not. Where is the data? Where is the information? Who is the actual party that we're taking advice from? Is it PAHO? Is it WHO? Is it the CDC? And albeit we may choose one of those entities, we've got to make it relevant in the Bermuda sense.
But it was the Bermuda hospital stats that they showed.
No, and in respect of the actual data, Don. So where is the actual data that shows that it's necessary to lock someone up in a quarantine facility for 14 days? What it amounts to at their expense, what it amounts to is, we don't trust you to stay home. That's what it amounts to. So the data may be supportive of the fact that quarantine is required. What it does not say is that step further, that you have to now quarantine at a government facility. Now, Don, I don't know if you have the luxury of paying a mortgage or paying rent. And it actually doesn't matter, because both situations, if you now have to quarantine, you've got less money to pay for either one of those while your house is empty for 2 weeks. Is the government...
Oh, we just lost that. Mr. Griffith, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I totally agree with that, because it's difficult to see the basis for this being, a reasonable decision by the government. What it shows is the exercise of power rather than any attempt to get the sense of the citizens as to the way in which things should proceed. There's been none of that. Where's the discussion being where people can express their view as to whether or not such a regulation akin to the creation of an offense should be introduced? And look at the consequences, and the financial consequences in particular for poor people in Bermuda, who are most likely to be the ones primarily affected.
Are there any other cases that are similar to this that you see that Bermuda has a no legal standing on, maybe in the European Union or one of the British overseas dependent territories?
I'm sorry, Don, I didn't hear that.
Oh, sorry. Are there any other legal precedents that you see where somebody else in another country has sued against what they feel might be oppressive restrictions?
Well, it certainly hasn't happened in the United Kingdom, where I am. But at the same time, a former Supreme Court judge here, Lord Sumpter, has been somewhat critical of the way in which the government has proceeded, purely through the exercise of their power and the introduction of rules without any parliamentary discussion about how things ought to be handled for the country as a whole.
What did Lord Sumter say? What did he say exactly? Lord Sumter?
Well, if you have a look at YouTube, you'll see it.
Okay.
It's quite a lengthy speech made by him at Cambridge University.
And I think, Don, to your point about what he said, one of his quotes from that speech is that we may realize 10 years down the line that rushed laws were more dangerous than COVID-19. And the effect that it will have on families, both financially, psychologically, what you'll see is psychological or psychiatric evidence from experts that actually will give evidence of the psychological and psychiatric effect that confinement has on an individual, particularly when that confinement does not relate to a criminal offense, but is actually in relation to a choice in respect of their personal body. And so that's one of those quotes from Lord Sumption, is that, look, we must be careful that rush laws are not more dangerous than the virus itself. And what that really amounts to is a question of whether or not the restrictions are reasonable. And in the case of the applicants, they say that they're not.
The part of the thing, looking at the original modeling for how many COVID deaths and sickness that was going to happen in Bermuda, which were vastly wrong, because we're nowhere near the top end of the deaths on that. But they assume like 25% of the people would not obey stay-at-home quarantine. So you've mentioned the monitoring bracelets, and Mark mentioned the slap on the door. That's a serious problem if people won't stay home.
We'll find them, Mark. That's how let me give you by way of analogy. And Dr. Griffiths is an expert in criminal law. He's done criminal law all across the world. He's represented people in respect of genocide, all sorts of crimes. And in respect of those serious offenses, there are serious punishments. And so in respect of, if we can recognize that, hey, listen, we're doing these things in respect of a problem that we have, what we say is public health. And that's a serious issue, we say. And when I say we, that's what the government maintains. And in that respect, if you breach it, there ought to be serious consequences. But what you do not do, it almost amounts to that schoolboy scenario in the classroom where, Eron talked, everybody's staying inside for lunchtime. That is wholly unreasonable. We have to be able to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of our citizenry. And we cannot penalize those who will be compliant, those who will abide, which is a vast majority of our population, and penalize an individual at the risk of what? Their private family life, their relationship with their daughter. As Dr. Griffiths mentioned, listen, you are potentially criminalizing somebody when they have no actus reus, no mens rea. Our legislation does not provide for a defense of reasonable excuse or justification. And that's one of the fundamental issues that Dr. Griffiths will raise. We don't have, listen, we've seen people come before the courts because in the middle of the night, they've had to go and get their young child from their other parent's house in the event of emergency. We've seen a situation where a business owner, but for a leak in his business, has had to stay behind, and he breached quarantine in its technical strict analysis. But did he have a reasonable excuse? Had he not stayed behind to take care of that leak, he would have made curfew. He had every intention of doing so. But you know what? He has to appear before the courts, and the magistrate's court is a creature of statute, and they're bound by the law. And the law does not provide for a reasonable justification defense. And so that's one of the fundamental issues. That's one thing that Dr. Griffiths and Mr. Pettingill will raise. We have every confidence that on a number of issues, and it's a layered approach. This is not casting a very wide net. It's a layered approach for some very serious, succinct issues, taking them one by one, looking at them on their merits, and asking oneself whether or not that goal could be achieved by less restrictive, more reasonable measures.
Right. It seems like, and I've sat in court on several occasions when people have had to appear before the magistrate, that a lot of the people who are getting fined are breaking curfew by like 30 minutes or less. They're somewhat close to home, but yet we're not seeing, for the most part, people who've been throwing parties, people who were supposed to stay at home out on the first day partying. If those kind of cases were being brought forward, do you think people would be taking it more serious?
Well, I think that's a hypothetical situation that realistically is probably distracting from the core point, and the core point being that the regulations are more onerous than they need to be in light of what we say is the threat or the public interest that we're trying to address. And that is the point. If we are saying it's serious, the regulation should reflect that by way of the punishment for the breach. And those individuals who have the parties against the regulations and the like could be subject to those criminal offenses. But as Dr. Griffiths says, listen, what offense? We're focusing now on the actual quarantine. We're a government who previously recognized, we have to remember, this is not the first time a government facility quarantine has been in place. It's the first time now that we're sitting here and saying that you got to pay $4,000 for 2 weeks. It's the first time that we're sitting here and saying you will be charged with a criminal offense if you do not do so. What if you cannot afford it?
Right. What if look back over Bermuda's history, especially like during yellow fever? What precedents do you think government might call upon, or the smallpox from the 40s and 50s, that you'll have to defend against their arguments?
Yeah, Dr. Griffiths and I talked about this at length. And, the reality of it is the Constitution is a living, breathing, ever-evolving entity. It's an ever-evolving document. We have to interpret it in line with modern times. Perhaps in times gone, we thought that it would be appropriate. We have technology. We have when you really look at, this is the point. Mr. Pettingill represented individuals in respect of a same-sex marriage challenge. And in previous times, that was actually subject to a criminal offense to actually be a homosexual. And we in modern society have recognized that that's abhorrent. That's ridiculous. They should not be prejudiced or discriminated against as a result of their personal choice. And the courts, the highest court of our land, the Privy Council, has ruled that, that is permissible. And any legislation that would seek to restrict it is unconstitutional. It would be a breach of their fundamental rights. And they've upheld that. Now we're talking about the injection of a foreign substance and the decision of an individual simply not to wish it, to take it. And they should not be penalized. If an unvaccinated individual or a vaccinated individual can go freely after their negative test, why then cannot an unvaccinated individual, when they pose the same risk of transmission, the same risk of catching the virus? Albeit, we're going to get down to a numbers game of percentages and the like. The reality of it is they can catch it. So, Don, the question. Yes,
Eron, will you mention the point I made to you about the Nuremberg Code?
Yes.
Following the Second World War. Make that point.
Yes, so essentially, and in fact, I'm going to pass that back to you, Courtney, because the reality of it is I want everyone to understand the serious consequences that we have with respect to consent, getting a patient's consent, and coercion. What many Bermudians feel is that this is a coercion campaign, because a father who has to choose between having a relationship with his daughter or simply going into quarantine that he cannot afford, what is he going to do? He's going to sit back and he's going to say, you know what, perhaps give me the vaccine against my wishes. But Courtney, can you enlighten the Bermuda public about what the actual Nuremberg Code is and the penalty with respect to breaching that, and how we came to have that Nuremberg Code?
It was about the challenging of the freedom of individuals, being forced to accept tests of material being developed when the consequences of what might happen to the individual was not known. That's why that code was introduced by the Allied forces after the Second World War. So that's 70 years ago. And yet now this government is saying, we're not too sure about, potentially what might happen with these vaccines. But guess what? You're going to have to take them. And if you don't take them, this is how you suffer. I can't see how that can be right.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate both of your time today and Mark's time too. He took a little bit out of his busy schedule as well. And just a very quick wrap-up word, Eron.
Well, I think we just really, on behalf of the team at Chancery Legal and Bedford Row Chambers, 25 Bedford Row Chambers, would like to thank the Bermudian public who have contributed in respect of the crowd justice campaign. We look forward to advancing this matter before the court. I know that Mr. Griffiths is certainly eager, as is Mr. Pettingill, to vindicate the rights of Bermudians. And it's not just in respect of those applicants, because there are far wide-reaching consequences in respect of all Bermudians. And the question really becomes whether or not their restrictions and regulations are reasonable. They say that they're not. And we look forward to getting a decision, getting some clarity from the courts, and then we can press forward. And with that, I'll pass it to Mr. Griffiths to say his final remarks. But Don, thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm just grateful to the citizens of Bermuda for the way in which they brought this problem to my attention, given that I'm so many thousands of miles away in the UK. And yet, the way in which they're approaching this topic gives me a certain surprise, because it means that they're attaching a great deal of importance to how this regulation is being brought in without them being consulted by the government as to its appropriateness in any way at all.
Okay. All right. Thank both of you again for showing up. Just to push back a bit to your statement earlier, Eron, that I have run the numbers on the cases in Bermuda. People have been vaccinated, and they're a lot less percentage-wise. The last time I ran the numbers of catching COVID on the breakthrough. So, like the last set that I did was 1 in 123 people who hadn't been vaccinated got it, whereas it was people who've been partially vaccinated was 1 in 454, and people who've been fully vaccinated was like 1 in 2,000. So
I want to be very clear, particularly because we're ending here, and I don't want to end on that note, because I want to be very clear that there's no dispute with respect to the fact that in respect of this science at this point in time, that, hey, listen, the government says that if you're vaccinated, you're less likely. Even accepting that to be true, then who are we protecting by essentially imprisoning someone at their expense? We're protecting those that we're imprisoning, those that we're financially restraining. That's who we're protecting, because if you're vaccinated, then great. You've got less likely of a chance to get it. We're not certainly protecting you. We're protecting, listen. So it's a tone of, we know what's best for you. We're going to protect you at your expense. And the question is not a dispute in respect of the science, say, Don. I want to be very clear there. It's accepting. Let's accept it for the sake of this discussion, that is true. the question still becomes whether the restrictions and regulations are reasonable. And the thrust of the argument is that the proposed amendments are not reasonable. And we look forward to the court making a decision on that. And thank you, Dom, for having us. Thank you, Dr. Griffiths, for being available. Thanks to Mr. Pettingill. As you will have seen, he's actually overseas traveling at the moment. Certainly, we're hoping that we can have this matter before the courts, before June 6th, so that travel back to Bermuda can be as smooth as possible. But thanks again, Don.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we're all concerned about civil liberties and the loss of them. So, we don't want to see that eroded. Again, appreciate everyone for being here today. Mr. Griffiths, Mr. Hill, and Mr. Pettingill, on behalf of Burr News, I'm your host, Don Burgess, wishing you a beautiful afternoon.